Danger: Joe Biden's administration is at risk of being sued for concealing Harry's records. As we reported previously, U.S. officials have rejected a request to make Harry's visa file public, and this is coming amongst questions over whether or not he lied about his drug use in the past. But just last week, lawyers working on behalf of the Heritage Foundation went to court to try and force the Department of Homeland Security to speed up its response to their Freedom of Information Act request about Harry. Judge Carl Nichols refused to issue an injunction, and he encouraged the U.S. government to give an answer to the conservative think tank one way or another by Tuesday. But on Wednesday, the lead attorney working for them, Samuel Dewey, shared a letter from Jimmy Wolfrey. He is the DHS senior director, and in this letter, he refused to confirm or deny whether or not they even have Harry's papers on file. To the extent records exist, this office does not find a public interest in disclosure sufficient to override the subject's privacy interest, he wrote. Now, the merits of releasing Harry's visa application weren't talked about at last week's hearing in D.C., and that means that Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank, is now going to have to use further legal means to force the DHS to release the files. In a furious statement that was posted online, the Heritage Foundation's Niall Gardner hit out at the decision. He said, "This argument makes no sense, but is not surprising coming from the zero-transparency Biden administration. The Department of Homeland Security's efforts to stonewall the Heritage Foundation's Freedom of Information request are unacceptable, and we will be contesting their position." Now, obviously, people are tired of the rules being different for celebs and these alleged VIPs. The same rules should apply to everybody. But different rules for the rich and powerful do exist. This is a real problem in our world. And the fact that they're not going to release the application certainly proves that Harry was not honest about the drug use on his form. If he had been, I think they wouldn't have any problem making this information public. And it is important for the American public to know, because if it was just Harry from down the street, then he couldn't get away with this because he wouldn't be royal. Things should be fair for everybody. I mean, what, is it okay for Harry to bring drugs into the country just because he's a prince? To be fair, it would probably be advantageous for the people of the UK if this information doesn't come out, because if Harry were found to be ineligible for a US visa, then he would have to come back to the UK, and they certainly don't want that. And it could be that they don't want to allow it because it would set a precedent, and everybody that had their visa application denied for that particular reason could easily start an appeal process, and they would have grounds to sue for discrimination if Harry's application would be approved after his miscalculated confession. It could be a low-level diplomatic crisis. Clearly, there's also an element of public interest here. Here is a very overprivileged person allowed into the country in spite of self-confessed behavior that could block entry, and normal American people are entitled to know whether or not the law is being applied fairly and consistently. Also, should it turn out that Harry was afforded special treatment, the people who did that and the people who tried to cover it up should also be held accountable. Under normal circumstances, a reasonable argument for privacy could apply, but since Harry has already published the most private details of his life, including his sexual activity and his drug abuse, privacy concerns could hardly apply because the information being requested is pretty minor in comparison to what he's already revealed. Now, Harry has already admitted to taking many different drugs, so either he was honest when he filled out the forms and he admitted that and they allowed him in anyway, or he did not disclose it on the forms, and now, even though they know by his own admission, they're just not doing anything about it. Either way, Harry has admitted to drug abuse, and he's living in the US. They're allowing that. You or I would have been denied entry, or we would be kicked out. Let's also talk about the way that Harry entered the US from Canada. Well, he came in on Tyler Perry's private jet, and apparently it was a last-minute decision to beat the COVID lockdowns. So when exactly did Harry apply for his US visa? Because he couldn't enter the US on his Canadian visa, I assume. Did he even have a Canadian visa? So should Harry have been prevented from entering the US if he couldn't produce his visa? Or was he trying to travel as a UK diplomat even though he's not? He also does not represent the UK in any capacity whatsoever. Is this whole visa in question something that he applied for after entry to the US, which theoretically he shouldn't have been able to do, and he should have had to apply before he entered? Was there somebody who allowed Harry to enter the US, or did he apply months earlier for a Canadian and American visa? Something certainly is very fishy here, but it seems like Harry is overly confident traveling back and forth from the US. Obviously, he's not expecting to encounter any problem. The group only want answers to the drug usage question, which shouldn't breach data protection because Harry already revealed his past drug use in Spare. And if Harry was honest on his application, then what exactly is there to be worried about by releasing the information requested? The more they try to hide things, the more that people are going to automatically assume that the rules were broken. It's much easier to just show the paperwork and prove that either he lied or he didn't lie, and that the rules apply to everybody. It doesn't matter about your background. Because the thing about it is, there are people who have been permanent citizens in the US for decades, and these people are working the whole time. They're paying their taxes and never even getting a parking ticket, but they still have to renew their green cards every 10 years. And sometimes people can send in all the paperwork and the money too, and they still have to wait a very long time to know whether or not their green card application was approved. And say there's some crisis in the family. Well, they have to go home and then they have to beg to get a temporary visa just to leave. So how is it that Harry can keep jetting back and forth? As they say, rules for the rich and famous, and then different rules for hardworking people. Now, if a person is suspected of not being honest about all questions on an official form, then surely the file should be released, and the contents of that should not be made public, only the final decision. There shouldn't be any discrimination whatsoever between the rich and famous and people of status. Everybody should be treated equally. I thought that was a big part of what the US stands for. Furthermore, Harry bragged about how popular and famous he was as the royal spare, but what he has said about his older brother Prince William was horrible. It is important to remember that William was generous enough to let Harry work with him as a joint heir and team, but perhaps this wasn't such a wise decision after all. Harry was given a platform and he was given a voice that enabled him to build a whole fan base, and this may never have occurred if the future heir of the time had guarded his role more selfishly, just like Charles did with his younger siblings. When Meghan entered the picture, she came to understand that she had a ready-made platform of followers thanks to Harry, and now they claim that they've been the most famous couple in the world at that time. Meghan also made the assumption that because Harry had such a public platform, then he was going to be king. I don't think she ever understood the line of succession. Ironically, though, it seems like the only person she managed to trick was Harry, and when the divorce finally hits him, it is going to be Meghan who's going to come off worst, because we already know how unpredictable and unstable Harry is. He's going to turn on Meghan, and we're going to hear what a horrible person she really was. If she thinks Harry won't turn on her, boy, does she have another thing coming. And don't be afraid to click the subscribe button to get more updates in the future. Thank you so much for tuning in, have a lovely weekend, and we'll be back to see you all tomorrow.